Number 3 is a lack of thoroughly tackling the issues along with making commentary. In other words, if you're going to translate the book and make no commentary, or you're going to make commentary and you're going to address the issue. As for making a comment, putting a couple of lines, leaving the reader lost, confused, and stuck, that is not going to work. It's not going to work. And we're going to mention a perfect place in which the translator did this. And not only was he confused others, and he left the door open. Moving on, point number 4 is a lack of consistent academic terminology usage and sometimes the occasional use of choppy words. Even though the translation is thorough, but it isn't perfect. In some places, he used some choppy points of language. And perfection is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Khayr, inshallah. Moving on. We have some notable quotes. Alright, the first notable quote is in the beginning of the book. The author, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon his soul, he says, category number 1, in the very beginning of the book, he says, give me 1 second, I had it marked, but I lost my mark. Allah is with the patient. The first notable quote, he says here on page 5, category number 1, sound hadith. Ma'rifat as-sahih min al-hadith. He says, no, may God enlighten you and me, that hadith in the view of the scholars of this discipline fall into the divisions of sound, sahih, fair, hasan, and weak, da'if. The sound hadith is a supported hadith, al-hadith al-musnad, the isnad of which coheres continuously through the transmission of one upright and accurate person from another up to its point of termination. The sound hadith can neither be, and then he goes on. Alright, now the reason why I chose this quote is because this is the foundation of hadith terminology. What is hadith sahih? And as you can see here, the terms are very rich, academic terms. Sometimes they're very strong, sometimes they're a bit mellow. But that was the first point in which we wanted to mention from the book. Then we have page 167. The author in the translation, he says 165, 166. Anyway, this is the point of, he says, guidelines for the transmitter of hadith. He says here, some of these guidelines have already been treated, were required in their previous categories. The science of hadith is a noble science, consistent with good morals and virtuous habits, and incompatible with bad morals and shameful habits. Allahu Akbar. That the science of hadith and bad character, bad habits, like water and oil, they do not mix. And the sciences of hadith and good character, good moral behavior, go on like white and thobe. They say white on rice. The author in the translation, he then says, it is one of the sciences of the hereafter and not of this world. Allahu Akbar. So this is an example for you, hadith disciple. Why are you seeking hadith? For the people's praise, for wealth, for money, for fame, for pomp, glitter, and gold, or for the hereafter? You may study in the College of Sharia and get some worldly benefit, inshallah. You may study in this place or this sheikh here, get this ijazah. This sheikh knows you, he recognized you when you went to his house, so on and so forth. He gave you tazkiyah, that's fine and that's peachy. But hadith science, the true nature, of this culture here is what? He says it's for the hereafter. And that doesn't mean that you can't get no benefit in this life, but the true benefit is in the hereafter for this science. And this is the reason why so many people have turned away from hadith science. Let alone because of its difficult, burdensome nature, but because the fruits of it do not, they don't come as quick as the fruits of the other sciences. He then says, let whoever seeks to take up teaching hadith and lecturing on some of its sciences first make his intention sound and pure, and cleanse his heart of earthly aims and their stains. Allahu Akbar. That kalam is beautiful. You want to teach hadith science? You want to be a hadith disciple, a hadith teacher? Then you should clean your heart. He says, earthly aims and their stains. So there's a difference. You may not have an earthly aim. You may have sincerity, but you still might have sediments. Your heart still may have stains and specks of dunya, and of praise, and of wealth, and status, and women, and this and that. Clean your heart, ya akhi. Ask Allah to rinse your heart. Ibn Salah then says, furthermore, Let him be on guard against the affliction which comes from the love and heedlessness of rank. Beware. There used to be disagreement over the age when it becomes suitable for a transmitter to take up teaching hadith and to be appointed to relate them. Our view is that when the need arises for the hadith in his possession, it becomes desirable for him to take up relating and spreading them, no matter what his age is. We heard that the excellent judge Abu Muhammad ibn Khalid al-Hurmuzi, the author of al-Muhaddith al-Fasil, God bless him, said on the basis, the author, he says, God bless him, there's the translation, he says, on the basis of report and reflection, it seems correct to me that the appropriate age for a transmitter to begin teaching hadith is 50 years. Allahu Akbar. Until you become 50, you shouldn't teach hadith, according to this author, al-Hurmuzi. He says, because that is the end of middle age, and when physical maturity is realized. Suhaim ibn Wathil said, I'm 50 years old, at the height of my powers. The trickery of events has given me experience. Allahu Akbar. Khair inshallah. Let's move on in the time that we have here with one of the points of criticism in the book. One of the points of criticism in the book. Khair inshallah. The author, Ibn al-Salah, rahimahullah, and I think we have another point here. Let's see how much time. Let's read one more notable quote, inshallah. Just bear with me. It says here, category number 21, page 76. He says, forged hadith, ma'rifat al-mawdu'. He says, the forged hadith is the fabricated, made up hadith. Be aware that the forged hadith is the worst kind of weak hadith. It is not permissible under any circumstance for someone who is aware that a hadith is forged to relate it, unless coupled with a declaration that it is forged. This is different from other kinds of weak hadith, which may possibly be fundamentally truthful, inasmuch as it is permissible to transmit the other kinds of weak hadith to instill virtue and inspire fear, a targhib or tarhib. As we will explain shortly, God, He is exalted, willing. A hadith can be known to be forged only by the acknowledgement of its forger or something equivalent to this acknowledgement. Sometimes scholars come to recognize a forgery by interference or until the end of his speech. Alright, talks about the fabricated hadith. Now, our last point here that we want to mention, Bidnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is a point of criticism on page 59. Category 14, he says, unfamiliar hadith, ma'rifat al-munkar min al-hadith. He says, we read that the expert Abu Bakr Ahmad ibn Harun al-Bardiji wrote that the unfamiliar hadith is one which a single man is alone in transmitting, while its text is not known from any transmission but his, not from the line of transmission, etc. The point of criticism is in the footnote. The translator, he says, the term munkar is problematic, and translators have differed in their rendering of it. The difficulty results from a shift in its significance over time. The earliest writers of hadith used it as a synonym of general terms like da'if and mardud. He then quotes Junibal, who was an Orientalist, a vicious, malicious Orientalist. He then says, word justifiably translated, rejected. He translated the term munkar as meaning rejected. He says, later Muslim authors attached a more specific meaning to the word, usually one close as here to that of shadh. So then he says it's synonymous to shadh. He says, see the remarks of, and he quotes another Orientalist. He then says, there can be no doubt that the usage of later writers ultimately derived from the definitions of the munkar hadith provided by earlier scholars. However, where the earlier authors were describing the general characteristics of the broad class of hadith they found unacceptable, the later ones interpreted these descriptions as referring to one specific type of unsatisfactory hadith. Now, that speech right there, it's not one line, it's not two lines, it's several lines, several sources. He didn't quote any original Islamic sources. That's a problem. Even in the translation, if you're speaking to an English audience and you're tackling an issue, and a serious issue like this, hadith munkar is one of the most important concepts of hadith science. You have to quote. And if you're going to make 20 pages in your introduction talking about this political issue and this person and that person, why would you totally neglect and disregard the issue of munkar? That right there could have 2-3 pages of footnotes in itself, and an issue that has to be tackled if you're going to talk about it. If not, then just give a literal outward translation of the word munkar. So to give justice to the translator, he did quote the difference of opinion among the ulama, the later scholars, the earlier scholars, the general meaning, the specific meaning, etc. We don't have time, and it's not the proper level or stage to go into take out the scalpel and dissect and slice and tear apart this concept or this issue, but it is important, and there are other places like this in the book that is a point of criticism. A point of criticism for the translation. Khair, inshallah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Alright, let's stop here by reading the summary on the back of the book. The author, he says, or the translator, he says, after the Quran itself, the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam form the most important foundation of Islamic thought. And that is also a concept in itself. Is that absolutely correct? He says, the hadith were accounts usually brief of the words and actions of the Prophet. Usually brief? All the time? Most of the time? Especially when you start talking about rulings. Alright? Ahkam, injunctions. Most of the hadith ahkam, or not most of them, but many of them were what? Were lengthy. Many of the hadith ahkam are long. Okay, so that's an issue in itself. He then says, as such, they were subjected to intense scrutiny by generations of Muslim scholars. Good. Better known as the Muqaddimah, Ibn al-Salah, 1181 to 1245. That is the common era, the Viking calendar. He says, composed this work while serving as the head of the Dar al-Hadith al-Ashrafiyya in Damascus, one of the most prestigious institutions for the study of hadith in the Islamic world. And that's another problem that we have here, is that if Ibn Salah studied in this institution specifically for hadith, then the translator should have studied in a specific institution dealing with traditional Islamic sciences, let alone hadith. Khair, inshallah. Let's put away, Let's put away the knife and let's just read. He says here, he provides a complete overview of the science devoted to the study of the works and actions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and also a guide to the terminology and techniques of the scholars of hadith, as it summarizes most of the previous work on the subject and forms the basis of almost all later activity in the field, as we mentioned. The book enjoyed immense popularity and influenced most subsequent writing on the subject, as we said. He then says, the translator, Eric Dickinson, has degrees from the universities of Michigan and Yale. He has taught Arabic and Islam at Yale and Hunter College in New York City. Where is the Islamic education? The traditional Islamic education. We don't want to disrespect nobody's university or no one's background or nobody. Not saying that you can't learn, but there lies no doubt. The one who studies Islam in Yale, or even Arabic from Yale, is not like the one who goes to the lands of the Muslims for years and studies Islam. It's not the same. Okay? The one who wishes to learn Aikido Jiu-Jitsu, and he studies it in America in a dojo, under this person and that person, that's good. But he cannot become a master and reach a high level and a high rank until he travels to where? He has to go to Japan, whether he likes it or not. Even if it's just for a visit, for a week or two or a month, he has to go to Japan. And he has to see the original art taught, practiced, and exercised by the original native masters. And that's anything, alright? A person who studies culinary arts, he wants to be a chef, so on and so forth. What do most of them do? They take a trip to France. They take a trip to London, so on and so forth. You have to travel. And you have to have studied on this traditional place. Wallahu a'lam. Khair, inshallah. Moving on. He then says, in addition to publishing articles on hadith in Arabic, biographical tradition, and learned journals, he has contributed to the Encyclopedia of Islam, the Encyclopedia of the Quran, the Medieval Islamic Civilization and Encyclopedia. His first book, The Development of Early Sunnite Hadith Criticism, appeared in 2001. The reviewer, Munir Fridi, is an associate professor of Islamic Studies in the Department of Near Eastern and Asian Studies at Wayne State University, Detroit, USA. Khair, inshallah. So this book is a series of translations of classical works. The grade that we give at Hadith Disciple for the translation and the presentation of the book, out of 5 quills, we will give him bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala 4. 4 out of 5 quills, inshallah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's a very good book. Any self-respecting Hadith disciple will have this book in his library. I'm going to give a special shout out to Sheikh Habib from East Orange. Sheikh Habib, make sure you have this in your library, inshallah. Make sure you buy this. Bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the end of this humble, brief presentation. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us all true Hadith disciples who benefit from the academic books of the Sunnah and Hadith science. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Thank you all for watching. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.